we're going to have a look at trimming more mature blueberry bushes. If you've been joining in with the grow along, then the chances are that the bushes that you have are more immature than what these will be. If you haven't had a look yet, then the last video on the grow along, I'll put the link in for that, we had a look at just trimming them to tidy them up, but they want very little amount of trimming compared to what we're going to do today for the more mature bushes. If we keep our bushes trimmed well, then they should last for many, many years to come. The bush that I'm mainly looking at trimming today is around 5 years old. So it would have been 1 to 2 years old when I bought it, and I've had it for around 3 years. And we want to then start looking at opening up the bush. We also want to look at removing any of the older wood in order to encourage new growth. And then we will also be taking cuttings from these bushes and hopefully propagating some young plants as well. So in this bed here, which is in next to the strawberries, I have 2 of the blueberry bushes. This one nearest to us here is the most mature, and then that one is a year behind. It's going to be difficult for me to actually show you with the camera and sort of be able to see the depth of it because it just all molds into one. I shall do my best. With our younger bushes, we don't need to do much trimming at all except for removing any old or diseased branches. But for our older bushes, we are really looking at taking out some of this thicker growth that is down the bottom. So it's this stem here, and then there's a few that are just a little bit behind that one. There are some things that we need to consider before we do this. So what we obviously want is as much fruiting shoots and leaves as possible. So on the end of the bush that you can see here, this is our fruiting bud, and then further down the stems, the smaller buds are our leaf buds. Hopefully this one's a bit easier to see. So this is a fruiting bud, which is bigger at the top. So this little part here, and then further down we have much smaller buds, and those there are our leaf buds. So as we trim this, what we're trying to do is make sure that we don't remove too many of these fruiting buds, but we also have enough trimmed that we encourage new growth and new branches to shoot up from the bottom. And then beyond this, we're looking at any damaged or diseased growth that we want to cut back. So you can see here we've got some that is dead on the end, so we'd want to be looking at removing those and leaving us with an open network of the bush as well, so it's not overly crowded. My bush, you might be able to see, is heading towards the strawberries. That's because on the side of these we've had lalandi actually shading them. These trees are nearly completely down now next to them, so we should see some improvement of that, but I am going to need to look at trimming to keep them within the area. They're also netted, so these ones that are coming very far out, then they are going to be causing an issue and being squished back by the net. Mine are netted from birds, but if you find that the birds don't actually eat them, then you don't need to have these netted at all. As we take off some of this growth, we'll also be looking at which of these stems and branches will be helpful to actually propagate from these as well. So we're going over that at the end of the video. We want to make sure that our secateurs have been sterilised so we're not passing on any sort of infection. And then the very first thing I'm going to do is right down to the ground is remove this very thickest stem. So this is likely to be around 5 years old, if not 6, and it's going to make room for more younger shoots. And just take your secateurs and remove them. It's really a good idea to evaluate after every single cut of what's happening. You do not want to cut too much and then decide that we should have not done something. The next largest stem on this bush are these 2 here. I'm not going to remove both of them because I think that's going to remove too much of the flowering buds for now. So I'm going to remove this outer one here. Now let's go right down to the soil level. These are ratchet secateurs. If you struggle with normal secateurs, they are definitely worth purchasing. This is going to have removed a considerable amount of the bush already. Now I'm going to start looking at this branch that's coming out to the side. So because we are having to net them the majority of the time, nearly all of this is pushing the bush over. So although it is earlier to trim than I normally would, that one's coming out. So that's the major trimming that I'm looking at doing at the moment. And then now we want to start looking at any diseased or dying branches or any that are crossing each other and rubbing. So we don't want too much of that happening. To really follow the stems up and work out where it is that they're coming from and going to before you start cutting. I'm going to take these two smaller branches off from down the bottom here. And any that are dying that are coming out the side of the stems, I'm just going to remove them as well. There's a new shoot here that is browning on the top, so I'm just going to take that one down to a bud, cutting at an angle so the water can still come and run off. This shoot once again is going out of the cage, so I'm going to take that one down. I'm not going to remove too much of the bush as it's going to the side. Once the trees that have been in the way are no longer shadowing it, they should start correcting themselves a little bit anyway, so I'm not as worried about that. If you've got any branches that go higher than the main part of the bush, it's also worth giving them a little bit of a trim back just so they're more in line. Going to make it easier to cover as well if you do need to. Hopefully you can now see that actually this bush is much more open. So the couple of branches, the older ones that we've moved down the bottom, have allowed a much more airy structure here. And then we have plenty of these flower buds and fruit buds still remaining on the bush. I have removed less of the branches that are going to be crossing over currently because, as I said, I'm expecting this bush to redirect itself when the sunlight changes because of the trees that have been removed from behind it. So now what we've got left is hopefully many more branches that are healthy, and by removing those older growth, we are hopefully going to be providing ourselves with more younger shoots, which will provide us with more fruit in the long run as well. If you have a really old bush that has mostly old growth, then you may find that you need to cut it back really very, very hard, and it will affect the next few years of fruiting. But it's definitely worth doing, and it will give you more production in the long run rather than having to actually replace those bushes. It's always worth making sure that we pick up these trimmings off of the compost, and if you haven't actually fed your compost last year, then you want to give it a layer of ericaceous compost to ensure that these are going to fruit well for us in this coming year. This is the younger bushes that are in pots that we've been using for the grow along, and you can see that these are really starting to bud now. So these are all the fruiting buds, and then these ones further down, which are much smaller, are the leafing buds. We don't need to do anything more to them. We did trim them ever so slightly at the end of last year. So to propagate this, we want some compost mixed with grit. This is just going to help it really drain and encourage those roots not to rot. So I'm just going to mix that in. Another scoop of grit. You could also mix in a bit of sand here if that's what you have, but we want a really open, textured, well draining compost mix for this. And then we're going to grab ourselves a pot. This is probably about a 2 litre pot, so a slightly larger pot for more cuttings, but obviously if you have less cuttings then you could use a smaller pot. So all I've done is gone through those cuttings that we've just taken off the parent plant, and then I've just taken off these younger shoots which we're going to use now. to try and propagate from them. We ideally want them to be younger. We don't want them to be woody. That's not going to help us to actually root these. And we want them around 6 inches deep. We're going to use some rooting powder. The another option would be some raw honey that we're just going to dip these into. That's just going to encourage them to root. And then I'm just going to take a clean knife and we're just going to very gently move some of that stem off of the bottom just to expose some of the core. We don't want to go too deep on this. We're just taking that little bit off. So just shaving it basically. And then we're just going to dip it into the rooting powder and then pop it into the pot around the edge. Next, we're going to give these a good water, and although these are normally in ericaceous compost, it's not really a problem to put the cuttings into normal compost. This is just peat-free compost with the added grit added to it. And then once we have found that these start to root, then is the time that we'll be moving them into ericaceous compost. So one way that we're going to find out whether or not they have rooted, and we want to give them probably at least 3 months before we are starting to do this, is just to gently pull them, and if they've got some sort of friction holding them down, then they're starting to root. Another way is to start checking the bottom of the pot and seeing whether there's roots coming out the bottom, but it is highly likely that some of these will fail, but we should hopefully get a couple of additional bushes out of these. Cuttings and younger bushes want to now go into a protected area for at least a year, and then once you've potted them on, I would keep them for at least another 6 months inside a polytunnel greenhouse or one of the cheaper greenhouses, just to make sure that they have plenty of time to put on some roots and hopefully grow into those healthy bushes that we want them to.